Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru invited director of IIT Delhi then because he wanted his grandson to be given admission, Rajiv Gandhi. And he was very embarrassed to ask him. So his daughter was in the room and he said, oh, now you can have tea with her and, it'll be very nice. And then she asked him that, what do you think about the possibility that Rajiv may join IIT Delhi? And he was a very intelligent man. He said, yes, madam, I can help hugely with Rajiv's, studying engineering. I have lots of friends in the UK and I'm sure they'd be willing to help and I'll put Rajiv in touch with them and do it. But at the same time, I think he safeguarded certain norms that were sacred at IIT Delhi.
Lights never went out on campus. All day and all night, there'd be somebody working. The students would be shouting at each other across dorms because everybody knew everybody was awake and working. But the professors, there would always be some lights on in the wings because the professors would be working harder and harder to do better and better the next day for their students.
So after all those arguments in the panel, he just sent me a chit from the other end of the table saying that, no, see me after the panel, and we met for some time. And so he said, no, I think what you say makes sense. The mission is more important than the strategy. And he opened up recruitment for ITC at IRMA.
Very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this evening. I should mention that we're kind of recording this session for those who can't join us on Clubhouse because it's kind of iOS only for the moment. We've got a stellar panel. We'll introduce them very shortly. But first, I'd like to kind of introduce the Founding Fuel team that's with us. There's Kavi, Ram, Anmol, and my co-founder Charles, who's going to be with me moderating the session. So we'll kind of dive in first in terms of setting context to what this session was about and why did we kind of plan this. I talked about the panel, and I think there's one thing that perhaps unites the panel, and this is something I'm sure nearly all of them will agree, that they're products of a pretty fabulous higher education system that provided the foundations for their professional and academic careers. I think it simply proves that we did get some things right back in the 50s, extending into the 60s and 70s and 80s, because the story of TIFR, IIT Kanpur, the Indian Institute of Sciences, IRMA, and IIM Ahmedabad as world-class institutions with a wider, deeper social mission is, to my mind, truly extraordinary, right? These stories are as much about visionary leadership that was shown by the likes of Homi Bhabha, Satish Dhawan, Ravi Mathai, P.K. Kelkar, Verghese Kurian. That's what we're going to be tuning in today. And why is that? Because somewhere along the line, we may have forgotten these stories of institution building. And it would be fair to assume that many in the new generation simply don't know about this legacy or the history. Because amidst all the brouhaha, kind of generated by what's going on at Ashoka University, it might help us to perhaps rewind the clock a bit and look at some of these lessons from the past. In fact, that brings me to, since we're talking about Ashoka, I know my colleague and moderator, Charles, has been watching the developments unfold there. So, Charles, what are you picking up?
So thanks, Aji, for that. But, what we do know is that there is much controversy around the happenings at Ashoka University after Pratap Mehta's and Arvind Subramanian's high-profile exits. And I've been listening to the many narratives that around what may have transpired. And one narrative doing the rounds is that intellectual freedom has been impinged upon by the government. And now, while this is an interesting narrative, I'm not quite entirely sure if that is the full story. And I am actually waiting for the full story to emerge. Then, of course, then there is the other part that, there's a lot of private money that has been poured in to create Ashoka as well. And there is no taking away from that. There are many fine minds have made it their home. So the other narrative has it that this it is this money that has attracted these fine minds to the place, and what is happening is an outcome of too much money finding its place to those institutions. Now, I don't want to get into the merits or demerits of this argument either, because this argument does not cut it does not cut eyes with me either. But what I do believe is that how the Ashoka story eventually turns out, it will have a bearing on other universities, new universities such as Kriya, Plaksha, Azim Premji University, and Jindal University, among others. And I'm a firm believer that there is much that can be learned from history. And what we now know is that creating a world-class institution isn't easy, and that is what is becoming apparent as we are looking at the Ashoka episode emerge in the public eye. And after the honeymoon period is done with, there is a lot of slog involved. And when this slog involved, what leaders at the helm do, that is what defines an institution's trajectory in the future. And it takes time and effort to create a world-class institution. And like IG was saying earlier, India has done this before. It's not that such institutions have not been created earlier. And that is why we're having this conversation and have some really fine minds in the room out here. So before we dive into the conversation and ask questions of these people who have been part of these entities, IG, do you want to take us through the housekeeping rules on what you have in mind for us?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. We keep it simple. I think we're going to look at a first round with the panel of speakers today, and then we'll start opening it up for questions and comments. So do kind of, let's try and kind of build this as an interactive session, but do keep your comments or questions as succinct as possible in less than a minute or so. And you have the option of, for first timers, that you can raise your hand. There's a button there if you have a question, and our moderators will come and bring you to the stage. So that's it. Charles, you want to start with the quick introductions and the questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like to start with Ashok Misra. Ashok, if I may come to you just for the audience, Ashok Misra is currently affiliated to the National Academy of Sciences, and in earlier avatar was director of IIT Bombay. Now, Ashok, you joined as a student at IIT Kanpur, and if I have you right, you were part of the second batch. Correct me if I'm
fifth batch.
The first batch. Wow. Now that makes
no. We were the fourth batch.
Fourth batch. Okay. Now that is that goes back a long way. So if I may ask you, Ashok, what stayed with you, and you were also the director at IIT Bombay, and what narratives have you retained, as a director at IIT Bombay? There were two hats that you wore, as the student and then as a director. What kind of stories may you have to share, from your memories?
All right. So let me start with the IIT Bombay because it's more recent and more current, if that's okay. Let me just mention the IIT system that goes back to Kanpur days and the Bombay days, and I was a faculty at IIT Delhi for 23 years. Is that the IITs enjoy a huge amount of autonomy. Autonomy in almost everything, in academic, research programs, whatever they want to do. The only place the autonomy is a little wanting is the finance, because the finance comes from the government. They aspire for excellence in all spheres, in everything that they do. And it's right from the beginning. The founder director, P.K. Kelkar, did that at Kanpur, and I try to do that in Bombay as a, not the first director, but whatever, 6, 7 director. Then the governance system is very sturdy in the IIT system. And I can allude to that when questions come, how it's weak in some of the other universities, both private and public. integrity is a very important part of the IIT system, and ethics. Everything that we do, we try to be as ethical as possible, and I should say we are ethical in all the systems that we do. So that defines the IIT system, and that's the kind of things we did in IIT Bombay to take it forward. When I was there, we empowered all means faculty, heads of departments, deans, to give their best in whatever commitments they took in either administration or their academics to take IIT Bombay to the greater heights, as we call it. Try to improve the governance system and so on. And there are other things that will come up. I'll leave it at this. We also emphasized on building leadership, which is wanting in the country. Several things we did for that. And the result was that even after I left, there were about 8 or 9 directors in the IIT system which came from IIT Bombay. So that was a good contribution to the country. I'll leave it at that because I don't want to hog so much time.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Ashok. You spoke about leadership, and I just wanted to kind of pick up the threads on that with Sanjoy, because the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad, which he was part of, devoted its entire mission to creating leaders for a new India. In some ways, Sanjoy, for those of you who don't know him, very few don't. He's had a extremely terrific career in finance and investing, and he spent his early years at IIM Ahmedabad, where his dad, the revered Dr. S.K. Bhattacharyya, taught as one of the founding team members under working very closely with Professor Ravi Mathai, who was the first full-time director of the institute. So, Sanjoy, I'm sure you have fond, vivid memories of that period. Do you want to share some stories that stay with you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I think Ashok spoke about a lot of what was also very important at IIM. One of the things, and IIM was truly fortunate that Professor Mathai was the first leader. And that, I think, was a stroke of genius by Vikram Sarabhai in selecting such a fine person. And actually, he came to IIM Ahmedabad from IIM Calcutta, where he used to teach. And I think one thing that stood out with Professor Mathai was an abiding sort of commitment to a set of beliefs. For instance, the belief that at all times there must be, integrity was one, which Ashok spoke about. I think a second thing was a commitment to the institution rather than any personal advancement. The institution always came ahead of any sort of, personal sort of fame, glory, whatever. I think another thing was conduct, personal conduct. He led by example. And I think that is really important. For instance, every batch of IIM Ahmedabad, I think till 1984, the day they would join, he would give a talk at classroom 324, where he would say, you have entered the portals of a great institution, but remember that in a few years, you will be judged not for what you were taught here in terms of the subjects, but for the way in which the people who deal with you see you as an individual and how you conduct yourself. So that is what you must always remember. If someone says he graduated from IIM Ahmedabad, the idea should be that this is a wonderful person to deal with, who's fair, transparent, competent, capable, and capable of taking on leadership roles. He emphasized this, I think, with many different examples. Another thing that stood out, I think, at IIM Ahmedabad in the beginning, of course, the autonomy and the finance part both apply to, I think, the IITs and IIMs, the comments that Ashok made. But I think one other thing that is very important is that no matter how senior or junior faculty members were or administrative staff were, there were a set of clearly grounded principles. And those applied equally to everybody, whether the professor was very senior or very, had recently joined as an assistant professor or an associate professor. I just give a simple example here. So there was a very distinguished professor, outstanding classroom teacher, but one of the sort of things that Professor Ravi Mathai believed in, and he shared it with all his colleagues and said, this is how we're going to achieve excellence as a business management institution, is we must also attempt to translate what we teach in the classroom into a consulting practice, as well as commit ourselves to research. And that research is to be communicated through papers, through books, through addressing various conferences, and this must be worldwide. And in fact, IIM had a collaboration with Harvard at an academic level for many, many years, which extended till the early 70s. And this professor in question did not sort of entirely buy into that thing that he should spend time doing research. And he certainly didn't believe in consulting. And his area of focus was actually economics. So he was not even very significantly involved in, let's say, being on government committees, policy making, and so on. And when it came time for him to be appointed or be elevated to the next level, I think a bunch of people, 2-3 people in the appointments committee, despite his seniority, and it was very, very difficult because he was one of the people who joined the institute very early, took the stand that unless he sort of believes that these things are important and he focuses himself on achieving certain standards here, that he's not going to be elevated to the next level. And I think that's guts. Institution building also requires a lot of courage and a determination that certain basic principles are inviolable. And that's how you sort of make sure that, you aspire to excellence. Because the minute people can game the system and say, oh, I can get away with not doing this, which is now very true of the IIMs. I mean, we haven't seen any world-class research or consulting, for that matter, from, IIM professors in the last 20 years. So I think once you recognize you can game the system, that's when the rot sets in. And that's what Professor Mathai and a bunch of his colleagues really stood for, that you got to have a set of liberal values, a clear set of beliefs, well articulated, understood by all, a sense of shared purpose, and then the senior people have the courage and determination to make sure that you stay on track.
Sanjoy, that's an outstanding set of narratives that you have. So if I may very quickly summarize it, institution over the self as opposed to fame and glory, autonomy, no juniors or seniors. You shared a narrative about a certain gentleman whom you have declined to name, take consulting assignments, so
or policy making.
practice.
Because as an economist, you're much more involved in policy making.
Absolutely. So practice led and not just
Correct.
focus on research. That's a very important point you made, and I think there's another very interesting point you also made. That we haven't seen any world-class research emerge out of IIM in the last few years. So very, very interesting.
But even consulting, Charles, I should add that in the early years, in the years from 65 to, I would say, the late 80s, some of the most famous strategic and, what shall I say, intellectual battlegrounds in terms of the role consulting played in shaping the success of various companies was actually driven by professors at IIM-A. Professor Labdi Bhandari, he was hugely important in Nirma, taking on Hindustan Unilever. If you look at even someone like Professor Amar Kalro, his contribution in L&T, there were lots and lots of people. I would say even my father, who eventually set up a consulting firm, Professor Ishwar Dayal, who worked with State Bank of India. So there were many, many people who helped to develop young, sort of growing companies at that time. Larsen and Toubro in 69 had a turnover of 100 crores. And there were 2 IIM profs who were significantly involved. State Bank of India, likewise. they did a reorganization of State Bank in terms of its organization structure in the early 70s, and that stays to this day. So it's very important because those learnings and what you said gets reflected in the classroom in terms of what you communicate to the students. So it's not just about a set of rules or axioms. It's about how you can move between the three and enrich all of them. And that's why Professor Mathai emphasized this, that you got to consult, you got to research, and you got to teach. And you got to achieve excellence in all three. And that is missing now, sadly.
Well, thanks so much for that, Sanjoy. I'm going to use that as a segue to bring in Rishi into the conversation. For those of you listening in, Rishikesh Krishnan is currently director at IIM-Bangalore, and then earlier avatar, he was director of IIM-Indore, and he's and a fellow at IIM-Ahmedabad, and he's passed out of and he passed out of IIT Kanpur. Now, Rishi, if I may put it this way, you've been there and seen it all. But if I may ask you to share some stories, from the IITs and the IIMs, the premier institutions that you've been to, which year and what institutions would you like to focus on? You heard Sanjoy speak and share some fairly provocative narratives. What stories would you have to share for us? Either from your student years, would you want to stay? What stands out for you?
Yeah, I'll just start with my student years at IIT Kanpur. Thanks, Charles. So one thing that really impressed me when I was a student at IIT Kanpur was the kind of autonomy which was given to students. So the way the entire students' gymkhana was structured, we even had a student senate, and the student senate consisted of elected representatives. The students' gymkhana president was subject to questioning by the senate. There was a kind of mini parliament almost happening within the institute, and it wasn't just restricted at that level. I mean, the student voice was very sought after by the institute as well. So I can clearly remember there was one summer I was the acting president of the student gymkhana because I was the cultural secretary. The president had gone on summer internship. So I was the acting president, and there were some really weighty matters which were being discussed in the academic senate. And the students' gymkhana president was a special invitee to the academic senate where only the profs used to discuss things. And I remember, I went and participated on behalf of the student body, and I actually got time to speak. And I remember many of the professors who were listening to me very carefully. Afterwards, they came and gave me some feedback on what I had said. So this whole involvement of students in the governance of the institute in almost every committee was something that really impressed me. And today, you don't really see that level of participation in governance in most institutions. And I understand a lot of this was due to Kelkar and Mutanna, who was the deputy director when Kelkar was the director. One story I've heard from Ahmedabad, which might supplement what Sanjay was talking about, was Ravi Mathai's insistence on faculty taking ownership of decisions, and people in the committees and so on who were basically faculty members. He used to kind of push back issues. For example, if a committee couldn't decide on something and they sort of pushed it up to the director and said, we are not able to decide, why don't you take a call? Ravi Mathai used to be very firm about pushing it back to the committee and saying, no, the way the whole place is structured, you guys have responsibility for this. You have to, take a call, and it's not for me to take a decision on this. So this, I think, embedded this kind of decentralized leadership in a place like IIM Ahmedabad. And I saw something very similar in IIT Kanpur as a student. One reason for, of course, both of these might have also been that both of them had a strong American influence. IIT Kanpur, of course, had support from a consortium of US universities, IIM Ahmedabad from Harvard Business School. But I think full credit to the Indian leadership of these institutes that they brought these principles into the institutes and made them work.
Thanks, Rishi. That was very interesting. We'll just quickly move on to our next speaker, Shiv, who most of you will, of course, know from his very, very interesting work at ITC. But Shiv is also was part of the second batch of IRMA. Shiv, right? And you've also spent 3 terms on IRMA's governing council, which I'm sure had given you a good perspective of how that unique institution with a rural management school was much needed for India. But I'm not sure if it would have happened without the strong support of Varghese Kurian and Ravi Mathai as well. Just walk us through some of your experiences and the stories that come to you.
Yeah, and Vijay. So I'll, through one story that I was involved with, and that will pull out an interesting aspect, is what I would share. Commitment to a mission gets tested when there's a conflict. How the founders deal with such conflicts define if they are visionary institutional builders or not.
Right.
IRMA came into being when Dr. Kurian was expanding the replication of Amul model across India, and not enough graduates from other management schools were moving into rural or the cooperative sector. So IRMA was set up with a mission that equitable socio-economic development, and the core strategy was cooperatives. So I'm from the second batch of IRMA, and after spending about 7 years in Gujarat Oil Seeds Cooperative, I felt
Shiv, we're kind of losing you.
and purposes, I became a non-grata from
Shiv, I think we can't hear you.
You just can't belong here.
Can you come again? We lost you. We lost you for 30 seconds or so.
Yeah, so when I left Gujarat Cooperative and joined ITC, I was saying I became a persona non grata because corporates were the last thing that IRMA wanted at that point of time.
Right.
And I said, okay, so be it. That's what I believe, that it won't work in the oil seed sector in cooperative. So a few years later, we had rolled out e-Chopal at ITC. And I wanted to recruit from IRMA, which is restricted to what is called designated organizations, the cooperatives or NGOs. And first response from Dr. Kurian was a shock, saying, what is this? So not only he said, now you want to recruit also. So anyway, so they had to accept. And actually a year later, I ran into Dr. Kurian in Delhi at a panel discussion like this. And I thought I'll make use of this opportunity to deal with two aspects that they held against e-Chopal and me, saying that, the core tenets of cooperative is that the enterprise must be farmer owned, and the whole value chain should be controlled by the farmers. And the second is that you eliminate middlemen to directly connect the farmers and the consumer. So whereas e-Chopal was not owned by the farmers in form, but I argued that the only way e-Chopal can thrive is by being ultra responsive to the farmers' needs and deliver whatever benefits, only then they will stay on. And second, I said, e-Chopal recognizes the role that middlemen play by making up for the lack of key infrastructure, and eliminating them would only mean more expensive. We just need to re-engineer the value chain and so on. So after all those arguments in the panel, he just sent me a chit from the other end of the table saying that, no, see me after the panel, and we met for some time. And so he said, no, I think what you say makes sense. The mission is more important than the strategy. And he opened up recruitment for ITC at IRMA. And of course, soon after to other corporate sector as well. And in fact, much to my delight, a couple of years later when his autobiography came, he actually wrote saying that, as part of something else, saying that no doubt some students join the corporate world, but I believe that given the years they just spent at IRMA and the insight they get into rural and agri reality and all that, they'll be part of transformation of rural India that we dreamt of.
Terrific.
So I think that's a kind of a spirit that the commitment is to the mission and not so much to the personalities and any of those kinds of issues. And that's what really builds the institutions. This is something that I've seen firsthand. And further, 2 years later, like you mentioned, I went on to the board of IRMA and spent a few terms there. That's really remarkable.
Terrific. Terrific.
Yeah. That's a remarkable story. In fact, Shiv, I had no idea that this was a conflict that you had gone through, because I certainly remember meeting you when you were setting up eChopal, and that I thought that was a very remarkable story, that attempt by ITC. And I also recall meeting Dr. Kurian, and I didn't know whether I had no idea whether I should be intimidated or whether I ought to be in awe of him. And I have absolutely no idea how did you take him on. And so the point you made about the commitment to a mission, and that it gets tested when there is a conflict, that's certainly very well taken. So so having said that, I'd like to use that as a segue to bring Meeta into this conversation, who like Sanjoy, who spoke earlier, Meeta also grew up on the IIM-A campus, where her dad, Professor Charan Vadva, taught, and later she herself taught there as well. And Meeta has been an investment banker, researcher, editor, teacher, and she has seen all of these institutions from close quarters as well. So Meeta, what stories may you have for us as well on how these institutions have been built out over the years?
Thank you, Charles. So many stories, because as you rightly said, I was a little child on campus when the campus was literally red bricks waiting to be built. So piles of sand and red bricks, though most of it was built by the time I started playing in those piles of sand, literally sandbox. I was a student there, I was a PGP there, and I had to face a demonical interview. And of course, it was horrible because I had to be totally stress tested. I mean, you heard of the horror stories, mine was horror plus. And of course, I went back and taught, because by that time, as Sanjoy rightly put out, by that time things had slowed down. And I remember being hired as an investment banker, being sent to New York to get trained in investment banking. And then I come back and I see, oh my goodness, IIM-Bangalore is teaching risk and IIM-Ahmedabad isn't. So just like all of us had been taught, the mission is more important than the person. You excellence is what you do. You step up and you do what you can, because an act of leadership is embedded deeply into you. I went back to the profs. And I said, listen, everybody in the world has moved on. You're the only ones who don't teach derivatives and don't teach portfolios and don't teach risk. I'm going to design the course for you and I'm going to deliver the first one for you. And the prof said, okay, here's a schedule. Here are flight tickets, but only local ones. This is how much I can afford, which was like pennies. You really don't get paid much to teach over there. But you come, you design it, and then we'll carry it on from there. He didn't need to consult anybody. The autonomy towards excellence is amazing. And so that's what I did. 96 and 97, I think it was 97. I can't even remember now. It was so many years ago. I went in there, and that was the first time risk and derivatives were taught at IIM-Ahmedabad, because it was the right thing to do. And I think that is what Ravi Mathai started off so many years ago, saying that it is all about the learning, it's about excellence, it's about the students, and the rest will follow. I mean, I totally, Sanjoy, from a previous conversation with you on another panel, I think IG, you had moderated that one as well. I remember Sanjoy said something very striking. He said the lights never went out on campus.
Wow.
All day and all night, there'd be somebody working. The students would be shouting at each other across dorms because everybody knew everybody was awake and working. But the professors there would always be some lights on in the wings, because the professors would be working harder and harder to do better and better the next day for their students.
So I have a funny story to tell here, which is personal. So my father used to teach accounting, and it's the most dreaded course in first year, first term. Everyone hates accounting, including the chartered accountants, because
Manak 1.
Manak 1. It's taught in a different way at IIM Ahmedabad than most people who've done BCom learn accounting, and it's taught through the case method. So it emphasizes the case method. So there's a case called Rocky Valley Cafe, which is originally a Harvard Business School case. And it had been, my dad had taught that case, I think, for 15 years. And I saw him one day. I was in school then, finishing school, and I came, I used to come for the holidays. And I sort of woke up early in the morning, a little before, 5:30, and I thought I'd just go and figure out what was happening at home. And I saw my dad sitting with that case, and he had a yellow pad, a legal pad from his talk at Harvard, sitting and making extensive notes about past things that had happened in the classroom at Rocky Valley Cafe and what he could add to it and how he could sort of, provide additional insights, or additional thoughts that had not come across perhaps as effectively in the first 15 years after having taught it for 15 years. And I think that's something about a commitment to teaching and achieving excellence, which I don't see people, doing right now. Staying up in the wee hours of the morning to make sure that your 8:30 class gets the full benefit of, whatever insights you have gleaned over 15, 20 years to share them with the students.
You're absolutely right, Sanjoy, because I was fortunate enough to see Dr. Manish Srikanth at SV Jain from close quarters before a class. I mean, he'd be up at some 3:30 in the morning preparing for it every time. It's not as if he's taught that same class for over and over again, but every time it would be a new challenge. I've seen that with... I was fortunate enough to have lived with my uncle, Tarun Gupta, when I was in Bombay, when he used to teach at Bajaj. And generations of students who've been taught by him there, strategic marketing and management, would get up at every day at 4:30 in the morning and kind of burn the midnight oil and do those jottings, write columns for Business India. And I think your dad also did his share of writing as well for media. This was a mission for them. It was far bigger than just work. It was, and students would constantly hang around at home, much to my aunt's irritation. But that's the giving that they did, despite the fact that they had a busy corporate career. At least TG certainly did. So that was fascinating. Thanks for that, Meeta, as well, for talking about the how do you kind of make curriculum and courses more cutting edge and bring in the more cutting edge stuff back into.
And I'd like to say one thing, in line with what Meeta said, and I think that is indicative of how when things change, it leads to decline, and how excellence can be sort of stopped dead in its tracks. So there is now an area in finance called behavioral finance, which is emerging more and more as an important way to look at how markets work and so on and so forth. And while there is disagreement among different schools of people as to its efficacy and the role it plays, there is no doubt that across the world, in the US universities and many other universities, at least people openly talk about it and expose students to its core tenets. In IIM Ahmedabad, there is now the level of academic insecurity because none of the existing faculty members have done any worthwhile work in this area, and therefore their attitude is to diss it and say, behavioral finance is just a bunch of wishy-washy sort of storytelling things which don't add up, it's touchy-feely, and we're not going to teach this to our students. And they're doing a huge disservice.
Right.
And I think it's done funnily enough, with a sense of purpose that ensures that they preserve that sort of halo, if at all they have it, about how smart they are. And they won't let anyone else come in from the outside to teach it as well. So I thought once I would go and make an effort to try and introduce this program and, even maybe, make some initial contribution to set up a center and so on. And the response is very simple. How you can thwart people if you want to. The answer given to me was, Sanjoy, you don't have a PhD. You can't teach a full course.
Right.
Ravi Mathai didn't ever say that.
Yeah.
In fact, many of the early profs, including my father, were not PhDs.
Yeah. That's right.
So I think it's in the mind somewhere. Having that ability to remain sort of, fluid or sensible in recognizing what you need to get ahead in terms of achieving certain academic standards.
Sure.
It's not just rigidly saying everyone has to be a PhD.
Sure. Meeta, you wanted to add to that?
I just wanted to say, I hope you pick on this later.
Yes.
Because the administration taking over from that sense of self-autonomy and self-freedom, self-efficacy, is totally critical to a strong institution that is focused on excellence. I do hope you pick it up again.
Yes, we will. I mean, this is an opportunity for others to also jump in. I'll open it up for conversation, which I'm sure there will be many who will want to kind of raise this as well. But before that, I wanted to kind of come to our last speaker really in the panel, Hari. Hari's been a dear friend, senior science journalist for over 3 decades. And he's kind of written widely both in India and in the US. But what's more interesting about Hari is that he's got a book coming up for launch, and I've been lucky enough to get some sneak peek into that book. The book is essentially about the coming of age of Indian science. And therefore, he's kind of done a lot of original research on the growth of TIFR and the Indian Institute of Science, particularly the stories of Homi Bhabha and Satish Dhawan, who in some ways, I think, transformed those places with their leadership. So I'd come to you, Hari. What stories do you have for us from TIFR and IISc?
Well, thanks, Aji. So TIFR stories are probably very well known. Baba, books have been written about him, and I'm sure people have heard. I will give a small story. I mean, first of all, I have no direct experience of any of these institutions. I didn't study at a large institution. I've just been a visitor there, and I've heard stories from other people. So someone told me recently about Satish Dhawan, how he changed the Indian Institute of Science. Before Satish Dhawan, it was supposed to be a very laid-back place, and then it was also quite small. Satish Dhawan recruited a large number of people, and he used to go out, meet somebody who he wanted to bring, and offer them jobs on the spot. And I've heard that he has recruited 71 people in just 1 year. I don't know. I didn't research this particular aspect, but what I want to say is one small story. Professor Balakrishnan, who everybody calls him Balki, who later became associate director of Indian Institute of Science. He finished his PhD, and he was going abroad on a postdoctoral fellowship. So Satish Dhawan heard that he's going out. He came and met him and said he should not go abroad. When you go abroad, you'll be a screwdriver and someone else will turn the screw. You have to stay here. You can become a faculty. So then Balki said that, look, I need some time. How much time do I have? So Satish Dhawan said, how about 20 seconds? So then he didn't go abroad. He joined as faculty, and this is how he recruited a large number of people, and that is probably one reason why Indian Institute of Science grew. Of course, his directorship was followed by two other very good directors in Ramasheshan and later C.N.R. Rao. But Satish Dhawan laid the foundation of the current Indian Institute of Science.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Hari, do you have anything on Homi Bhabha that you'd like to share, or should we move on to?
Well, there is a story that I've heard
Yes.
that when the when TIFR wanted to have a new building, and they had identified a small piece of land within the naval base there, and Navy was not willing to give it away for TIFR to build its office. So this is, I think, well-known story. Probably many people would have heard. So Bhabha wanted to talk to Nehru, but he didn't want to directly tell him that he wanted land. So the story is that he took Nehru for a stroll by the sea, next to where the TIFR is now, and said, "This is a very nice place of land, and we would like to build it. It will be very nice to build an institute." And that got Nehru, that got his interest, and then he got the land. And then the story is also that when Nehru came to lay the foundation stone, he said that it was a very difficult decision for him because the defense minister was after him. The defense minister will not let go of that land because he wanted it himself, and the prime minister will have to convince him, and so on. And but actually, that time the defense minister was Nehru himself. So.
Okay, that's a nice one. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll try and kind of open up the conversation now, because I think we've heard. Sorry, Ashok, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few things.
Yeah, sure.
During my tenure at IIT Bombay, and of course Professor Kelkar at IIT Kanpur, we did a lot of work to attract bright young faculty members, and then you had to change the system of making them an offer while you are on the run. So in my several visits to the States, there's one anecdote. This one very bright young fellow, he came, we interviewed him, and I had my deans and the core committee there, and he said, "Well, when can I?" The reverse of what Balki's story is, when can I know that I have an offer? I said, "Can you wait till 6 p.m.?" This is about 5 p.m. And 6 p.m. in California and the Bay Area, he had the offer letter. We had the offer letters ready and so on. I just fill out his name, sign and give it to him. So it's this kind of thing which Kelkar also did, and you have to do that to attract faculty. I'll make two other small points. We also in the IIT system, like the IIM you're talking about, but there's a lot of emphasis on teaching and research. In fact, in my tenure, we increased the number of doctoral students, the research infrastructure, and the like, to give higher emphasis on research. Of course, the government wanted us to increase the BTech students. I said the BTech students would not take us towards what we aspire to be, like an MIT. It's the research which will take you there, and that's what changed the whole ethos of that institute. Now it's rated the top amongst the IITs. Kelkar did the same thing. Now, what's important here is that when you do research, you keep changing the syllabus as you go along, because you are involved with the recent happenings in your subject. And that autonomy helps. You can, in the IIT system, you can change the syllabus whenever you want. You just have to take it to the Senate and say, "Look, this year I'll take these topics," and the like. And that's what keeps it up front with what's happening.
Right.
And that's where the autonomy is very, very important. The academic autonomy to do whatever research you do, whatever you want to teach, to take things forward. I just wanted to mention these two.
That's useful. In fact, I want to just pick up that thread on autonomy and being able to manage discordant voices, because that's the creative freedom that we're also talking about, which is at stake. And this morning, when we were talking about it on our morning call, I think my colleague Kavi Arasu, who's also teaches at various institutes as well. Kavi, you had a point of view in terms of how you see the narrative changing on that score. Do you want to kind of come in with your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Aji. The question that was there on my mind was about how in the modern times the opportunity for many voices to be heard has increased, and therefore there are many more voices that are up and about, and the response about managing these voices and giving space to these voices and kind of synthesizing these voices and getting things out has not happened as much as the effort to shut these down. And it's better off with silence than with symphony, if I were to put it that way. And that's what I'm seeing at many places. And that's what I was echoing in the morning call today.
Right. Anyone wants to respond to that? Do you agree with what Kavi is saying? Do you see that around you? The inability to, in some ways, build that symphony that Kavi is talking about, which perhaps in some ways is related to the Ashoka saga as well. But anyone wants to take a stab at it?
Just to start it off, maybe, because I'd really like to hear. I think Rishi is the master of this. I mean, guru man over here.
I agree.
Over here. But just a recollection, both of people past and present. I'm not only that there was a certain resilience in the way they were able to engage with each other, especially behind closed doors. And maybe in today's corporate world, that would be called toxic. But it was not toxic because the intent was always very, very clear that it never was a personal conversation. So these professors would shout at each other across the board table or the PGP table, etc. But not one of them ever took it personally, because you'd go and have chai together in each other's houses at 5:30 or 6 in the evening again. But you were best of friends, but you were fighting for the best thing that you could achieve for your students and for your research. So the issue again being more than the person, and that resilience to be able to, bring on a storm, let the storm come, but it will be the best thing that we can create.
That's very well put. Rishi, you must come in.
Rishi, I was just going to say that, Rishi, you must come in here since Meeta's already called you a master at that. And for those of you who just come in late, Rishi, before you just come in, I just have to give everyone a very quick rundown. I mean, we're having this conversation, just so that everyone has a perspective. We're having this conversation because, much of the media narrative currently is driven by all of the happenings around what is happening at Ashoka University. But the point we're trying to make out here is that, India has some very, very fine academic institutions like the IITs, IIMs, IISc, IRMA, TIFR, and there were some very fine minds that built it, and we have some terrific minds here who have witnessed these organizations come up, and they have institutional memory, they have fond memories of these places as they have come up, and the narratives we are hearing from them are stories of autonomy, how they practiced autonomy, how they put organization over the self, how the missionary zeal that they practiced, the leaders practiced, and how they showed the resilience to engage with each other behind closed doors. So in a nutshell, that is what we've been discussing until now. Rishi, over to you, please.
Yeah, so I think the ability to promote and not only promote but foster that kind of sort of discordant conversation that leads to better ideas and so on, it really depends a lot on the self-confidence of the leadership. If the leadership is going to perceive that every time a critical remark is made, it's a kind of attack on them, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to build that kind of culture in the institute. So I think we had a very self-confident group of leaders. I mean, if you just think of any of the people whose names we've been talking about, Ravi Matai or Satish Dhawan or even Professor Kelkar. Of course, I knew none of these people personally, but from whatever I've read and heard about them, they were clearly people who were very confident about themselves, certainly not worried by, discordant notes. And I think that's very important for, these sort of these institutions going forward. Let me also just add another thing, since you've been discussing, or you at least mentioned the context of some of the recent happenings in some universities. I think there's a big contrast here between what you might see as a kind of academic institutions discussion in a faculty meeting and what you would see in a typical corporate boardroom. It's not as though corporate boardrooms don't have disputes and discord. Of course they have, but there is a sort of implicit hierarchy. There is a sort of thing that finally when the CEO says something, everybody will fall in line. There's a certain reluctance to look at issues, once a decision has been taken. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing some conflicts today is because of the increasing involvement of corporate entities and corporate folks in boards. I mean, if I can just add one element to this, for example, if you look at a typical IIM board today, there isn't a single academic member on the board apart from the director and the two faculty members who are on the board. Everyone else comes from a corporate environment. And I sometimes feel that a lot of these corporate leaders, however distinguished they might be in their corporate careers, simply don't understand the kind of give and take and the kind of creative aberration that happens in an academic institution.
Yeah, if I may add to what Rishi has said, each IITs and IIMs have senates, and there are conflicts. There are people who, I remember one meeting of a senate. I think it went over 3 days, because there are lots of things to be discussed to change the curriculum, and there were agreements and disagreements and so on. But at the end of it, the decisions made are accepted by the Senate in totality, and the outside world sees, and that's what I talked about, integrity, sees commitment of the institute to what has been decided. So you can have inside this discordance, but outside it should be always projected as a solid one institution. Institution is always above the man, above the woman, above the person, I should say. And that is a very, very important lesson to learn.
That's right. Thank you for that. I wanted to come to a couple of people who haven't spoken on our speaker panel. Damodar, I wanted to kind of see if you had any comments or you've been listening intently. Thank you for joining us. Any thoughts basis what you heard so far?
Yeah. One angle I would bring about these institutions is the transformation role that they had towards generations of ordinary middle class meritorious students. Yeah, there were a generation before this. Schools, colleges of eminence were more privileged class. They had the character of more privileged class, more club. I think these institutions took care of the fact that across the board, the IITs, IIMs, IISc, etc., stayed very true to the merit as the basis of quality of intake and the same transformational impact. And waves of simple people from simple background actually became global class in terms of output. That also guarding that in a society where social hierarchies and privileges are a norm, guarding that through decades, I think also is a very important part of two things: institution building and also the transformation role at a societal level that these had. They did not perpetuate the club. They did not perpetuate inbreeding, if I may say, of any kind at all. And that to me is an important aspect which we didn't touch upon it, so I thought I would mention.
No, that's a wonderful point actually about selection, and building a meritocratic society. I think I'd heard some of the stories from Sanjoy, and I'm sure Rishi will have his own share, and so will Ashok and Meeta and others as well. about the effort that went into safeguard this whole focus on meritocracy and ensure that there were no pressures brought on board. Sanjoy, do you want to kind of narrate anything that?
Yeah, the one which is very well known is in Rajat Gupta's biography, where Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru invited the director of IIT Delhi then because he wanted his grandson to be given admission, Rajiv Gandhi. And he was very embarrassed to ask him. So his daughter was in the room and he said, "Oh, now you can have tea with her and, it'll be very nice." And then she asked him that, "What do you think about the possibility that Rajiv may join IIT Delhi?" And he was a very intelligent man. He said, "Yes, madam, I can help hugely with Rajiv's, studying engineering. I have lots of friends in the UK and I'm sure they'd be willing to help. And I'll put Rajiv in touch with them and do it." But at the same time, I think he safeguarded certain norms that were sacred at IIT Delhi. And it's there in Rajat Gupta's biography. The other one that I know of personally took place at IIM-Ahmedabad, when Professor Mathai and my father were summoned by a very senior figure, political figure, and asked whether his daughter could sort of be given admission out of turn in IIM-Ahmedabad. And he said, "Please let me know what I should do." And I think this is one of Professor Mathai's masterstroke. He said, "Yes, I will ensure that we provide you all the support that we can." And when my father and he came back, he told my father, "Please send him the application form. It's absolutely essential that he has the application form." So, but it takes courage. I think at some level, Professor Mathai sort of lived that throughout his life. That he had the courage to say, "This is the line in the sand that we don't cross." And that's why I think this idea of meritocracy being a driver of excellence across these institutions is so important.
That's right. Rishi, that has stayed true. I mean, that is not something that we wielded to in terms of pressure, right? Everything else, of course, I mean, there is enormous pressure from the government, but on this one...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we actually made some structural sort of elements to make sure that happens. For example, typically in an IIM as director, I have absolutely no role in the admissions process. I don't even know what the criteria are. I don't know who's doing the interviews. I don't know who is setting the CAT paper. So even if somebody tries to put pressure on me, there's nothing. I mean, I'm not involved. So it's much easier to deal with anybody who might try to put pressure, which people do try from time to time. But we have sort of put in place enough insulating structures within the entire admission process to make sure that it remains insulated from any influence at all.
Terrific.
Yeah, it's also the reputation that you build up. Since you're talking about stories.
Yeah.
In my tenure, 8.5 years, I was at IIT Bombay. No phone call came for admission or for faculty positions. Phone call came for chaprasi appointments, guard appointments and all that. But never for a faculty appointment or an admission, which is the reputation builds up and then nobody bothers to call you.
Terrific. I wanted to come to the...
One second.
Yeah, sure. Please.
You do get tested. I mean, I do recall that in my first year in Indore, there was some testing. A couple of people did call, try to, say so-and-so, there's this candidate, related to somebody and so on. So once you show that you have absolutely no interest in all that, then it just stops.
Sure.
I mean, actually, that was one of my biggest fears, IG, that because my father, he'd quit six years before that, many years before that. He was no longer faculty at that time and had no connection with Ahmedabad. But I was terrified that I'd be the first faculty kid to get in. I mean, luckily I wasn't. Apparently there are 3, one before me and one after. But I was absolutely sure that I would not be able to get in. Which is why I remember the grueling interview, because they had to prove beyond doubt that it was about the candidate. There could be absolutely nothing that says that it was about a relationship. It's never about a relationship.
Sure. So I'll come to Dayasindhu because Dayasindhu, you've been hearing, all the comments and the perspectives coming in. You might want to just kind of share in 5-10 seconds a little about yourself and the work you do, and share any comments that you might have for the panel.
And you have a historian's perspective as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is so very important to this.
Thanks, IG, and thanks, Charles. So let me just share a couple of incidents based on my time at IIT Madras and IIM-Bangalore. So one of the things we've heard so far is about the leaders and the exceptional qualities that they have, which is very true. In IIT Madras, I also got a feel of the exceptional qualities of the faculty, and that I think is the bedrock of these institutions. So I remember a course where all of us worked doubly hard, and we did more than what was there as a quote unquote a syllabus. And the faculty member was so impressed with the class that he decided that he's just going to give S and A's, so which are the top two grades. And typically in these institutions, there is a tendency to grade on a normal curve, right? So he fought his way through the department, and he fought his way through the dean and said that, hey, this class, these guys are getting this. Otherwise, we'll hold the grades till you guys agree that it needs to be done. So I still remember that, it took us some time to get the grades for that particular subject, but the faculty, had his way. And I was just, awestruck, because I thought that, hey, come on, this is clearly going against the set rules, and there are these big folks sitting in large rooms, the department head, the dean, and the director, and to see how a young faculty could kind of fight his way through was a revelation for me. And coming to IIM-Bangalore, right now we're talking about a lot of IT and how IT needs to be, checked and things like that. I remember when the internet first came to IIM-Bangalore, and it was the first IIM to get onto the internet way back in 1996. Funnily enough, it was the students who were managing access to the internet, managing the allocation of email IDs, and managing the web server. So Professor Sadagopan was in charge of the computer center at that point in time, and he used to tell us that, hey, these are the guys who are doing it, and it was a bunch of us who used to sit through the night and then ensure that the website of IIM-B was on and and the folks had the access to email. And I remember that we came up with one of the first rudimentary policies on spamming and email etiquette and stuff like that. And we had the power to, I think, to disable email connect to a person if that person had indulged in something which we felt was not okay. So it was amazing thinking back in terms of the freedom that the students had, and it was so empowering that the faculty had full faith in the students, and they believed that the students could manage this. In fact, these guys are going to manage bigger things later on, and stuff like that. So historically there's another very interesting thing that I need to highlight here in terms of how how an institution builds, let's say, a discipline in India, right? And the people who make it possible. So I'm talking about the entire the gamut of IT education as it began in IIT Kanpur, right? So IIT Kanpur got its first computer thanks to American aid, and the folks at the electrical engineering department were so what shall I say, forward looking, that they allowed a couple of young faculty at that point in time, Professor Mahabala and Professor Rajaraman, to just dive full time into computers. And at some point in time, there were some murmurs that, are they really doing any work in electrical engineering? They're just playing around with this new toy called computers. But lo and behold, computers became big. And in the 70s, when Professor Rajaraman decided to start an undergrad program in IIT Kanpur in computer science, He had all the freedom to go and ask other departments to loan him a couple of seats so that he could have 20 seats in the computer science program in IIT Kanpur. And that's so, I mean, he said that, I mean, the Senate was said that, okay, if, you could manage to put together a few seats from all the other departments, you're good to go. So that was the first undergrad program in computer science in India. So I think we need to also treasure the faculty and the kind of people we had as faculty, leave alone the leadership, and the kind of belief that they had and the kind of mindset they had. I think that's truly awesome.
Terrific. Charles, do you want to kind of lead?
Yeah, I think Kumar, you had a question to ask. Do you mind introducing yourself? And
yeah, I am. Yeah, thank you so much, Charles. I and IG were batchmates way back as evening scholars, and I'm a journalist who write for the Indian Express Group. My question is actually more while we have stalwarts and brand names here in terms of Indian education. I mean, we have some of the brightest minds in Indian education here. But my question is really, what is their thought process in terms of guiding the newer institutions which have come in? I mean, we have had proliferation of IIMs, and even if you look in terms of the leadership which is there, I'm not naming institutions, but say IIM, Bodh Gaya, Jammu, whatever. We have family members actually who lead, and the way the stature of some of the members, and which in turn has again a reflection in terms of the way hiring happens, and then how does one then navigate in an environment where actually finding quality faculty is a challenge. That's one. And the second is those established institutions which are there, like IIMs, for instance. While we have created new structures, corporate boards, and allow the boards to take a greater role, we have constantly, messaging and government interventions in terms of, okay, now you cannot do executive education program, get an approval for this. Then why have a board? Established institutions stifled in terms of interventions such as this. Newer institutions having a leadership issue in some sense. What is their thought process on this?
Good questions, Kumar. Lovely to have you. I think you raised two issues: whether whether we are spreading ourselves too thin, given the fact that we don't have a large enough pool of faculty to go around.
True.
And two, you're raising issues about governance.
True.
Is that the government continues to interfere when you've this has happened in banking and several other areas as well.
Yes,
but, but anyone wants to kind of take a stab at it? Rishi, do you want to kind of?
I think there is one big issue, and that big issue is that we have a challenge in leadership. In fact, I was just talking to somebody this afternoon, and when you think that there are 20 IIMs, and every 5 years you're going to have to find a director for each of these 20 IIMs, do you really have the kind of leadership pool which will be able to take all these institutes to the kind of right level? And I think the related question is, have we resourced all these institutions adequately so that they can come to speed or reach a level of maturity within a reasonable period of time? And my sort of preliminary answer to both of these questions is, there are serious challenges on both these fronts. As far as government involvement is concerned, I think sometimes it gets exaggerated. Yes, there are sometimes disagreements with the government on certain issues, but as Ashok Misra mentioned earlier, I think one sort of excellent feature of at least the IIT and IIM system is that the government really stays out of academic matters altogether. Very rarely does it get involved in any academic issue, and I think whether we sink or swim on academic matters, we are largely responsible for what happens. So I would certainly not hold the government responsible for that. But I think developing leadership is certainly an area where we all need to play a very serious role.
In fact, we should just stay on that if we can. If anyone else wants to take a stab at it, Shiv, Meeta, or Sanjoy, or
Ashok. Sorry. And While on that theme itself, I'd also want to probe Hari and Dayasindhu as well, very specifically on this one, particularly when it comes to the sciences. If you may have any inputs, whether the government does actually stay out of others, and whether there are resources available for research on the sciences, and whether there is an academic pool. What is your experiences been like?
Yeah. So as Rishi has pointed out, leadership is a huge issue. We are just talking about a handful of IITs and IIMs. If you look at the number of universities that you have in India, which is in hundreds, leadership at those are wanting quite a bit. And if we need higher education system to transform, we have to.
I think one thing I'd like to.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to say is that vis-a-vis the ability to raise resources, that if you manage to sort of cut the sort of umbilical cord or to reduce the linkages you have with the UGC and in a sense, therefore, with the government for funding. And there are plenty of ways to do that. I mean, if you look at some of the top class American universities and even some of the European universities, you can have endowments. Unfortunately, in India, the culture of giving back is still very much in its nascent stages as yet. Though we have examples of people like Nandan Nilekani and various other people who have made significant grant, but I think it needs to be sort of used in a way that is thoughtful and long term. And we don't have university endowments in India at all. And if you think about the fact that Harvard University has an endowment of $40 billion, and that's what allows Harvard University to do many, many things like attract top flight faculty, pay them well, build new buildings, bring new equipment, and a host of things. And it's not that difficult. If you understand, what Einstein called the eighth wonder of the world, the power of compounding, you'll be fine, because in 15, 20, 25 years, you'll have built sizable sums of money. I think the second thing in this regard is, how do you attract talent or leadership if you continue to pay them the kind of miserable salaries that they're paid? It's very easy to say that, people should be selfless, but in today's contemporary environment, I can't see that selflessness happening, because such people will get, much greater opportunity if they move outside education. So education, I think, has to address this issue of how it attracts talent and competes.
Yeah. So Meeta and Shiv,
one solution to both the points raised by Kumar, I think, is stepping up research and consultancy, and paid, and obviously each of these schools have some policies on sharing and all that. I think that is one way to improve the quality, get faculty to the context of the work that is involved, and which is also a way to step up resources of the institute as well as income for the faculty. And so we have done some of that at IRMA, therefore I can speak from the perspective there. That will significantly add both to quality and resources.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Meeta?
So one of the things that in my limited knowledge of what I've seen with some of the science folks is that there is a inherent reluctance to get into quote unquote admin of their institution. I mean, quite a few of the senior faculty members in the science stream feel that it's a pain. And I have, known a director of one of India's best science universities, say that, hey, I'm not a janitor, so don't come to me with these things, right? So I think there are a few people who are willing to, devote time to managing their institution, especially a technology or a science institute. I think. That needs to be, I think there needs to be a larger pool among our science faculty to come forward and to contribute to institution building. I mean, we've got some glorious exemplars that we've all discussed before, but I think they need to be a role model vis-a-vis, a role model of of a top-notch scientist churning out papers and doing research, which is very, very important. But also, I think some amount of nation building and institution building also needs to be, made motivational for them.
Sure.
So maybe.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
You make a great point there about the administrative load. And one thing I've noticed in universities globally recently is that these administrative positions of leadership, are often taken by more junior faculty. So in a way, it is a pre-tenure or a tenure track opportunity for them, rather than signifying seniority as it does in India. So in order to do that, in order to balance this, there's a very difficult hierarchy to rebalance in a way. And again, to Sanjoy's point about endowments often come from alumni. And you're absolutely right, this is very, very nascent. And I think these institutes are reasonably wise to be wary of alumni. I engage in about 5 or 6 alumni groups with IIM Ahmedabad, because of the kind of work that I do, including the gender story. And I can see how faculty are definitely holding us at bay, because there is genuinely a fear of alumni coming in a way, taking over the board. Because we do not yet have that level of maturity, that level of comfort, or that level of, I think, pipeline building in terms of leadership. Because board participation is one type of leadership, and of course, the directorship is another type of leadership. And I do not think we're having enough discussions, and forget about discussions, we don't have enough action on building that leadership pipeline. I think we need to build that maturity into our institutions rather than finding ourselves in squabbling matches as we see currently.
Right. We haven't heard from you, Ram. Do you have any comments, any questions that you'd like to kind of put into the mix? Ramnath?
Yeah. I was listening to Hari and, his really funny anecdote about, Nehru, holding the defense portfolio as well, and that, the fight between the prime minister and the defense minister, right? My question is around that. To what extent, is there a conflict between the bureaucrats, from the government, and how independently some of these scientific organizations and educational institutions run? Is there, other stories from the early days of IIMs and IITs and IRMA and others? That's the question I have.
So have we been able to, I think, remove the whole cloak of control and what have you that the ministry tends to place on the autonomy of an academic institution? I think we heard that bit from Rishi and from Ashok and a few others as well. Anything that you'd like to add, Rishi and Ashok, maybe? Ashok?
Yeah, so very, very briefly,
yeah.
Since the IITs and IIMs are in government institutions, MHRD does have a role to play. So they would like to once in a while interfere. However, having said that, the founding fathers, the Sarkar Committee report and so on for the IITs, they have made statutes and the act. And if somebody reads those, they are very, very clear how the institutions have to be run. And you can always quote the statutes and the act to say this is how things are to be done. Many times the government people don't read that.
Right.
But if the director has read it, you can always.
Right. Right. Thank you for that. I'd like to come to you, Anmol. You've been listening. You're the youngest in this group by far. What are the stories that stayed with you, given the fact that you belong to a new generation? Anmol incidentally went to BITS and has very very, very strong allegiance to the BITS institution, and he stays in touch with both graduates from there as well as his alums and seniors. Anmol, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating. It felt like going to a museum and listening to all the sort of stories.
Are you making us all sound like old fuddy-duddy folks out here?
Yes, I mean,
He just called us a museum.
Did he just call
He has just called us a museum.
Has he just humiliated us? Did we just kick him out of the room?
Go ahead, Anmol. We pardon you. Just this once. Don't use that word museum again.
I certainly meant that in a very positive sense. In fact, I'll share very quickly in 30 seconds the story I had. This was my day one of BITS. And day one of BITS, you're not actually happy that you've gotten into BITS. You're actually sad that you did not get into the IITs. So all of us are in the auditorium, and there's this sort of a feeling that we are in this new institute. And I recall the director coming on the auditorium. My parents are left, and my mom sitting left to me, my dad sitting on the right. And he asked us, the entire auditorium, that how many of your parents are engineers? Raise your hands. And a few hands went up. And how many are doctors? Another few hands went up. How many are businessmen? Another few hands went up. And then he asked how many of your sort of parents, etc., are politicians. And nobody's hand went up. And he said that, you all are here because of what you did. So that was a moment of pride, I mean, which I think all of us needed that on day one. So when I was hearing to all the stories of sort of leadership, whether it be, tactfully telling Prime Minister Nehru or Indira Gandhi, or sending the application forms, or even the other stories, in terms of how do you sort of look at building leaders, giving sort of accountability and ownership to people. Those are very interesting. I had a question to the panel. I mean, the context of the conversation today also is somewhat around the controversy of Ashoka University. So if you had a magic wand and you could advise or be in the shoes of the people who are sort of at the helm of affairs right now, what can Ashoka do? Because certainly it is a institution the country has been proud of for a number of years. There are some controversy right now, but what sort of leadership is needed now? What are some examples or things they should do to set the narrative right?
This is a good question, and we'll allow, I think, a quick 1 minute for each of the original panelists, starting perhaps with Meeta on top, and then Rishi and Hari, Shiv, Sanjoy and Ashok. Do you want to go, Meeta, first? I know you've been involved with the project at different levels.
In the sense, I was a very tiny research assistant and around for ISB and around at the time of the starting of Ashoka. But right. With your permission, I have to take revenge on Anmol for his. Anmol, your generation.
Go for it, Meeta. Go for it.
Your generation is the stack generation. Everyone here on this panel here has been through the days when computers were those giant room-sized things, and all of us know how to handle punch cards. We had punch card operators, and I swear that is the most tricky thing in the world, where you spend hours and hours and get something that you can get in 10 seconds out of your iPhone now. So some respect for those ancient days of the punch card operator.
Right.
Meeta, you forgot to tell him that we are among the folks who fought for to get the internet and fought to get broadband access.
Very much so, and in fact, IIT Kanpur gets huge credit for this. I think we should take a moment to talk about computerization and the big changes before we wind down, as you really want to, because it was these very IITs and IIMs that formed the government committees. I remember Professor Mohan Kaul in 1978-79 from IIM Ahmedabad flying down to Delhi once a week for these meetings, where you actually brought the internet to the country. And that's when the 1980s, 1990s, bank computerization, the whole television thing, digitization, all of that would happen only 20 to 30 years after the foundations had been laid. Very much the economic discourse of the day, but we'll pass on that. You asked a beautiful question, Anmol, about Ashoka and what they can do.
Yes.
I think they do need to, at this stage, calm the situation. I think they've done all the right things, technically. I mean, even though some of the letters are in super formal, what my kid would call MBA language or West Coast euphemisms, but they have had to, they have applied them beautifully. They've stayed the course, and everybody has done their part with a great deal of decorum. I think the students stepping up have also done their bit, and I do not think anything more needs to be done. I think they need to move on. And also, as they move on, I think they need to sort of prove that their spirit of excellence. So they will need to have one good success story this year, that their spirit of excellence has not been put away or something like that. So they will have to showcase one thing.
Got it. So Rishi, I'd come to Meeta argues that this will have no real knock-on effect if they ride past this current storm, and that it may be possible to continue to keep the culture of excellence alive. What's your view? What should Ashoka be thinking about?
I think they need to think of some long-term structural changes that insulate faculty from the thought processes and pressures the trustees face. I think that's very important. I mean, I can't imagine in a government institution the board members or anyone telling the director this faculty member is a thorn in the flesh and all that. I mean, it doesn't happen. They might think whatever they like, but there's very little that they can do about it. So I think one way to preserve academic freedom and to make sure it really gets embedded in the way the whole system works is for the trustees to be not at all involved in faculty hiring and firing and things like that.
Terrific. I mean, that's a very clear point of view, Sanjoy. One idea that you would kind of focus on if you were in charge at Ashoka to douse the fires. Sanjoy, you're on mute, I think. Oops.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
I think I agree very substantially with what Rishikesh said. The only other thing I think is, in an academic institution, you can have people who have very, what shall I say, clear views about various things that affect, who we are, how we live, what our society is doing, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that, as a faculty member, you should be saying that this is something that I want to have, the students support me in or whatever. I think a lot of this is personal views. In America, it happens all the time. You have Paul Krugman, you have a bunch of, people who are very, I would say, not critical necessarily, but who have very well-defined viewpoints on a number of things, even current monetary policy. They're sharply critical of the Fed. And, all of them are at top notch, whether it's Princeton, whether it's Stanford, whether it's Chicago. So I think there has to be a way that the academic institution emphasizes to people that your personal opinion and your responsibility to the students and to the academic institution need to be very clearly identified. And when you want to make that kind of, comment or contribution to the thought process, you got to do it outside of your academic, your institutional affiliations.
That's true. I'm just mulling over what you just said, Sanjoy, and whether something should have been
Can I raise a question to the panel because it supplements?
Sure.
Isn't the whole point of academia to be a sanctuary space for opinions?
And that to a liberal arts institute.
No, absolutely, Meeta. I couldn't agree with that more. I think what you got to do is to make sure that, it is a voice that you're expressing independently, but it's not an attempt to persuade people that they must sort of come to that same point of view academically. Even in Chicago, which is the ultimate economics university for right of center, monetarist thinking, it's called the Chicago School now around the world. Millions of finance ministers in Latin America and different places are from Chicago. Raghuram Rajan is from Chicago. But you don't do that because, you want to dominate or expose students only to one kind of influence. In fact, the best behavioral finance and behavioral economics profs are also at Chicago. And it's really interesting that this should be the case. And a guy like Richard Thaler and Milton Friedman both express themselves very clearly, but they don't sort of do it. They don't do it, to sort of persuade students. They express personal opinion. And it's outside the boundary lines of what goes on within the academic framework.
Yeah. I'll come to you, Ashok. I think there's a new speaker with us, Bala, who's just joined us. Bala, you have a question or a comment to make? Please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. So I kind of joined in a bit late, but I've got the experience of both in Indian institutions. So I am a product of IRMA, much junior to Shiv, who was there in the panel.
Sure.
But also was fortunate enough to study at Harvard for my Kennedy School public admin. So one of the things which kind of hit me was just in terms of the academic, from the administration side of it. I saw a lot more younger people being involved in the running of the university at Harvard. I mean, and kind of people who would be like in mid-30s to late 40s, right? I mean, that 30 to 40, 35 to 50 age group. Who kind of bring in a much more a sense of connectedness with the actual kind of users of the university, which is a student group, right? And that for some reason I found it a bit lacking in at least my exposure in at IRMA, for example, or the engineering college university which I went to. I mean, is there a case to be made of getting more younger people into the business of running these universities, right? No, I'm not talking about the academic side of it, but the running of the universities. Is there more of possibilities of lateral entry? Is there more? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of have only been a user, not been inside the system. So, and all of you have been. So, just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Sure. Ashok, do you want to kind of take that? The question that Bala is asking about if there is a role and a possibility of younger folks being promoted to leadership roles.
Yeah, so that's not even an issue. I think what you need is good leadership, whether it's young or old, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And several places there have been older people. I was one of the younger persons to take over IIT Bombay, so it doesn't matter. People have been younger than me who have taken over. What is important is that leadership has to be strong. The governance systems have to be in place. And on top of all this, the proper vision and mission of the institution has to be well articulated. If these three things were in place, I would not have expected Ashoka University episode, as you would calling it, to be in the press. It should be sorted out with the governance systems, with the leadership, and with the vision and the mission that the university has. Why is it in the press? I'm more disappointed to see it in the press rather than the actual happening. So I think that needs to be sorted out. So it's a young university. It's in my personal opinion, in its governance system, not mature enough to have not handled this case properly. Yeah. And they'll learn by experience, and hopefully in due course it will not happen. Yeah. It's not that people have disagreed at other universities all over the world and within India, but you don't see that in the front page of the newspaper. You know?
Yeah, so they promised to rectify a lot of this institutional lapses, but I'm kind of conscious of the time. Charles, do you want to kind of close the session with your closing comments and thank the panelists?
Yeah, I mean,
and our audience?
it's been an outstanding session. I mean, I've had much fun listening to your comments, and I could see that there were a lot many interesting people who've been joining in and listening to these. Listening to the stories, and we've this conversation has been recorded, so we will certainly be putting this out in the public domain as well. But some of these stories have stayed with me, and I wish we had the time to probe some of it. And like Kaiji said, we're certainly cognizant of the time. But to all of you who are logged in, and I'm sure those of you who've shared the narratives, there is the point that one point that emerged, the reluctance on part of Indian science folks to get into admin. Now that kind of stays with me. That is a lingering thought, and I'd like to kind of I don't know how far Rishi, before I just kind of close this. Rishi, is this something that just want to ask you? Is this a narrative? Is this something that you would agree with in the management domain? Is this something that you see as well? Before I just kind of close this.
Yeah, I think in general, in the last 15, 20 years, we have put quite a strong emphasis on research, particularly in terms of publications. And I guess for most people, the most productive part of their career is perhaps the first 10, 15, or maybe at most 20 years. So I think a lot of people are reluctant to spend what they see as their most productive time on what they see as admin roles, which in their perception may not be as productive or as well appreciated. So I think that is a challenge. I think earlier on people were willing to take on these roles at an earlier age. I was just thinking some earlier comments were being made that I actually was the MBA program chair at IIM-Bangalore well before I was 40. And I didn't seem to mind at that time. But I think if I went to a similarly 37, 38-year-old colleague today and asked him or her to be the chair of the MBA program, it's very unlikely that they would agree.
Great. Thanks so much for that. The reason I brought that up is because, I'm in the middle of reading this book, and I sincerely urge you already, if you haven't looked at it already, which is Walter Isaacson's most recent book, Code Breakers. And this speaks about how, this speaks about, about the kind of roles that researchers take on when the government collapses, and how they actually take on admin roles and actually go on to frame public policy as well, and the kind of pivotal role that has played in creating the vaccine, and why the response to the pandemic has been so exemplary. And the book is, it's very difficult to put that book aside. And so that's where this kind of thought came up from, that while it is, the slog is also part of it is part of the job, and for some reason it kind of that narrative just kind of stayed with me, and I just wanted to recommend that book very strongly. And I would certainly love to, like I said, we really want to pick up the threads of this conversation going forward and share this narrative with our audiences. So thank you so much for taking time out, IG.
Yeah. So thank you, Meeta, Hari, Rishi, Ashok, Sanjoy, and all the others who've contributed. There's Sivakumar and Hari, and all of you who've patiently been listening to this conversation quite late already. Love to thank you, and we'd try and kind of pick up the threads on this in Founding Fuel for sure once the conversation gets shared in the public domain. Thank you again.
IG, from a listener's perspective, may I thank you and Charles for getting such incredibly and some of the brightest minds of India at one forum like this. Thank you so much.
We're lucky. We're lucky that they agreed. That's all.
We're just lucky that all of them agreed. It's a privilege.
We don't have to. Thanks so much, folks. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank
Bye
you.
then. Good night.
Yeah, thank you so much for getting
Thank
us.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.